Hello, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of Karen and AEI, thank you for joining us today to unpack some of the recent significant developments in U.S. export controls and trade controls. Definitely significant, at least that we've seen in recent years. Today, we're going to be catching up on the recently announced pause on the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS's 50% affiliates rule, which was initially announced in late September of this year. We'll talk a little bit about what happened and what it means. And we hope to leave you with some key takeaways, hopefully help you if you're just catching up on key elements of the rule or thinking about what to make of the recent pause, and also hope to learn a little bit from you and hear from you as well. My name is Mark Nakla. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Kharon. Kharon, as many of you know, is a global risk and data analytics platform. We work with leading global organizations to support provide them with deep data insights and analysis on a range of illicit finance, trade, and commercial risk issues. I'm joined today by Michael Ford, who's moderating our event. Michael is president of TradeBridge Consulting, and he's also the co-chair of AEI's Trade Focus on Export and Global Trade Compliance Committee. Michael, I'll hand it off to you.
Yep, thank you, Mark. And as Mark said, welcome everyone to today's session. We're going to talk about an important topic that's hit us all. And, I want to try and help us get started, right? Where did all this start? Right. And then where are we at now? And then I think as we get into some of our discussion with Mark, what we should be thinking about, right? So when we think about this all started at the end of September, right? BIS came out. They had a new interim rule. So they issued it and made it effective the day before the actual publication in the Federal Register. And so very important piece. It put everyone, I think, into sort of a stage of, oh my God, what do we do? How do we do this? And BIS put it out and said, why are we doing this? Well, they've always said this has been a loophole in the export processes, who we're selling to, and knowing who the ownership are, right? So the interim rule basically came out and said, listen, any entity, 50% or more owned directly or indirectly, or in the aggregate, by a party on the entity list, listed in the military end user list, right, or certain SDN lists, right, would automatically be treated for export control purposes. Right, so that was very big change that BIS had put out. They gave us 30 days to implement, and then just a few weeks, and then November 10th, they announced, the White House and Treasury announced that this enforcement is going to be paused. Mark told us that, right? There's a pause. So this regulation has not gone away. It's been in a pause, and we're given 1 year. So November 10, just a few days ago, is when it was put on pause. And now we have a year at the moment to deal with this. And I think that's that is going to be a big part of what we are going to talk about today, right? So take a breath, possible short sigh of relief that says, okay, I have a moment here now, really what that is. And this is going to impact exporters, importers, right? And then internal teams, compliance teams, internal finance teams. And so it's only been deferred. Right. So what we need to do to comply is still real. Right. It's just a matter of how we're going to deal with this. So what we tried to do is put together, we're going to try and focus on 3 different areas, right? So what exactly does the 50% affiliate rule cover? Right. And we're going to talk about what does the 1 year pause really mean in practice? And we hope to give some guidance to say what you should be thinking about and doing now. And let's make sure that we use the time, this pause, wisely and be prepared as to what comes next. So what we know is it's been paused, right? And we all know things can change. But before we begin, right, I think we want to have how we're going to handle this today, and how we're going to manage information that we're coming out with. So we do have the Q&A open. And so I'm going to ask you, as information is being presented, you have a question, please use the Q&A button, and we will do our best to monitor and to address all those questions that come through. If there's an enormous amount, we'll deal with that and find a way to get back that information to you. In addition to all of that, right, there is speakers information, and we have some upcoming AAEI events. So that's part of our administrative task here. So welcome everyone to have your questions as you come through with this information. And I'll complete my role at the moment as a moderator is to let's bring on Mark. And so Mark, just want to kind of set those stages on some of those questions, and we can kind of work a little bit about, hey, this 50% rule. So I'll push it back to you now.
Yeah, great introduction. I think stepping back in time and thinking about what happened and how we got here may be a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw, as you mentioned, the rule was announced in late September with near immediate effect. And we heard a lot from industry immediately, from existing clients of ours at Caron, but also potentially new ones as well. And I have to say that I think my kind of reaction to the response was industry was incredibly, and I think also impressively proactive in paying attention to the rule and getting ahead of the rule and its expected implementation. And as you mentioned, now there's a pause. And so we have an opportunity here to think and talk about what is the right approach, not just what is an approach. What is an effective solution to address compliance with this new rule versus what's out there that I just need? How can I implement a process to get ahead and be in compliance with the rule when it is in implementation in less than 12 months period? Now, quite frankly, I wasn't surprised by any means when the rule was announced. We have been thinking about this from a different angle for quite a bit of time. I'll give you a little bit of background. So what the rule does, what the BIS affiliates rule, or otherwise known as the BIS 50% rule, it essentially kind of copies many of the same components of what the Treasury Department has on its sanctions list, the SDN list, and the 50% rule that's been in effect for close to a dozen years on the sanctions list. I started my career, and many of us here at Caron started our career at the Treasury Department, where we worked on sanctions starting in the early days after 9/11, way before the OFAC 50% rule was put into place. And what we realized immediately after the 2001 attacks and the expansive rollout of US sanctions as we know them today is that the lists, any US government list, is a snapshot. It's a window into a risk portal, not necessarily the whole picture. Whether we're talking about the sanctions list or an export control list, we're talking about dynamic networks here, right? If sanctions is targeting a specific terrorist organization, for example, or a specific drug trafficking or cartel network. These networks that are being targeted by US sanctions or US export controls are dynamic in nature, right? They're also resilient from what we've learned over the last decade or so. And so no one folds their business and goes home when their name is put on a list. There's always loopholes that these networks are maneuvering around. And the OFAC sanctions list implemented a 50% rule essentially to address this loophole. And now export controls, with the expansive nature of export controls and the expanded mandate of BIS, is now implementing the same rule to address almost some of the same loopholes that the OFAC 50% rule tried to address a decade ago. Now, this is by all account a significant development. This is a major expansion of US export controls. Up to now, trade and export compliance programs had focused on, the 3,000 or so names that are on the BIS entity list, or the 70 or so names on the military end use list that you mentioned, Michael. But with this new rule now, majority-owned subsidiaries are subject to the same stringent export controls and licensing requirements. So we're talking about tens of thousands of non-listed affiliated enterprises worldwide that are now within scope. So we mentioned a little bit, and I'm interested in your feedback on this, Michael, the loophole, right? What this development tried to do in an export control context is closing some of the long-standing gaps, which is the reliance of some of the listed parties on paper, at least, what seem to be legally distinct affiliates to evade restrictions. So by extending the 50% ownership threshold to affiliates of listed parties on the entity list or on the MU list or a component of the SDN list, BIS and the US government are now to end the loophole that allowed listed companies to shift activity to off-listed subsidiaries.
Right.
And so this goes after direct ownership, indirect ownership, aggregate ownership across multiple restricted parties. This is very complex. And so what does this mean? In practice, I think for all of us in industry and for our audience, this raises the compliance bar significantly. It's no longer enough to just check the name of a counterparty against the government list.
Right.
But managing supply chain now requires active situational awareness, tracing corporate structures, mapping networks of affiliates, recognizing where there may be indirect exposure that previously, may have flown under the radar.
So I'll add, Mark, I think your important word is non-listed, right? Because companies relied on, give me the list, I'll run it up against my customer, and if everything's clear, we're good to go. Well, this is a game changer, right? Because these are entities that you're not going to have on a list that is supplied by the government. So companies need to think about a solution in that area.
Yeah.
And when we say loopholes, what are we really talking about, right? Well, look, at the end of the day, products have arrived at Russia and they got there somehow. There's a loophole, and there are many different organizations. These companies outside the US, they know they're on the list. So like you said, there's always loopholes. Once they know they're on the list, they're going to make changes. Right. And that's the way it's always been. This definitely covers it now and starts closing out that loophole. I would definitely offer that.
Yeah. And I say proactivity is the name of the game here, right? Because these networks are dynamic in nature. And so even if we come back and we identify that, BIS says, well, here's a whole new set of entities that are subsidiaries of those that we previously listed, chances are there's already going to be some restructuring here. So not only are the loopholes dynamic, but I think the nature of our response has to also be dynamic in its nature to be able to, keep pace or even stay ahead of the dynamic nature of these loopholes.
Yeah, Mark, I would just add, I think you said a very important word, a snapshot. This is a snapshot of what's out there.
Yeah.
Once these things happen, loopholes, there then is corporate changes and ownership changes, and they're moved all around. So while today we may feel comfortable that we've done our due diligence, if there is a change in ownership down the road 3-4 months, that snapshot is no longer any good, right? So you have to stay current and diligence and know, about some of these changes that are going to happen sometime.
Yeah.
Right.
The good news is, I think, we've had, we at Caron, I mean, we exist almost for this type of development, right? Or these types of challenges. So, industries had almost close to a decade in experience as it relates to the OFAC 50% rule. I don't want to be grim here. There is already solutions out there in terms of how to adequately, effectively, and efficiently do this, not just to answer the mail, but really to implement a very effective and proactive program, intelligence-based and fact-based and data-driven program that supports the key elements of this rule in compliance with the BIS affiliates rule. Now, the good news is also we have a year now where, Michael, you mentioned this in your introduction, where in the recent presidential summit between President Trump and President Xi of China, there was a trade understanding where the White House recently announced a 1-year suspension of the affiliates rule beginning November 10th of this year. And both, I keep harping on pause because in both official US government statements, but also in press coverage after the presidential summit and the announcement of the pause, both make it clear that this is a time-limited pause. It's linked to ongoing trade negotiations, so things may happen, but it's by no means a policy reversal or a permanent rollback of the affiliates rule. And so behind the scenes, what this means is that if you go and look on the Federal Registrar's website, the interim final rule that was published in September is still there. It remains published. It hasn't been rescinded, but only its implementation is paused for 12 months. And just this week, actually on Monday, BIS issued a memorandum specifying that the suspension ends on November 9th of next year. And I thought it was actually very interesting that there's a clause in that memorandum where they say that the BIS will continue to evaluate national security and foreign policy interests related to how non-listed foreign affiliates of these listed entities are acting. And so I translate that as BIS is almost keeping an eye on enforcement mechanisms as it relates to export controls, and keeping an eye on who may be evading existing export control requirements and restrictions. And so, the affiliates rule, as we've said in so many different words, it still exists. It's almost sitting in kind of a regulatory toolbox, temporarily idle, but almost ready to be reactivated.
Yeah, Mark, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think it's in a pause and things can change, and things have been changing very quickly in this whole world of trade, right? So what we know now, right, like we said, there's a pause.
Right.
And we need to think about, okay, what's our plan of action? If we haven't had one, what can we be doing? And the hard part, Mark, is I know we want to talk and say, what's the, what should companies be doing? And if you're a small company, you're going to be having a lot more challenges versus, not that it's going to be easier for a larger company, but one with compliance and they understand the rules and regulations. It's going to be somewhat of a different path than a smaller company that needs a lot of help and guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is definitely, I would think of this as a window of reassessment and
Mm-hmm.
for preparedness or readiness. This is the time for everybody to kind of stress test their response, strengthen their how they're gonna do due diligence on affiliates and ownership structures. Think about how they plan to prepare for this snapback of enforcement when the rule reactivates at some point within the next year. And so, in other words, treat this as kind of a period of heightened monitoring and planning and a chance to get ahead of the next phase.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
The other thing I would note was, what we've heard from industry, and we've had a lot of engagements since actually from before the announcement of the rule, but since the announcement of the pause, I haven't seen a let up in energy as it relates to trying to find the right solution, and trying to proactively think about implementing a robust solution that supports this new rule.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't let up. And I don't think from our perspective here at Kharon that it's industry response and proactivity has been paused because of the pause in the rule. I actually think it's continued very effectively and efficiently in terms of trying to find the right solution. What we saw is that the rule, when it was first announced, sent a very clear signal through global industry, and industry's been reacting, and in many ways we've sort of been ready to support this type of effort, and we've been engaged with a lot of players in industry and thinking about what specifically they need and the type of insights and data and intelligence they need to be able to support their program as it relates to future implementation of the rule. The one thing I'll also put out there is, in global industry is not pausing on this. And I'd also say that, the rule caught the eye of many of the same firms whose bottom lines would have been and could have been and potentially will be reshaped by the level of transparency that this rule will now require.
Mm.
And so, put yourself in those firms' shoes. What are they doing now? Many of those actors may begin maneuvering potentially behind the scenes, restructuring ownership, setting up new intermediaries, even accelerating procurement, all sort of in an effort to protect their supply chains as governments and corporates increase and heighten their scrutiny because of this rule. Anything you want to add on that, Michael?
Yeah. So yeah, Mark, I just want to add a little bit. When we look at sometimes the export transaction, what we're really saying is, how well do you know your customer? And then the important also piece equally is end use.
Mhm.
So if you think about it, if I am selling to a distributor, that's just going to raise my level of compliance even more, because I'm selling it to a company who's going to maybe re-export it. And so while that regulation is there and it's placed on the exporter, because of that type of transaction, that's just going to make it a little bit much more difficult, in my opinion, just to know who your customer is.
Yeah.
Right. And who's using that. Who is using it? Because maybe I'm sending it to a third party and it's going to an end user. So it definitely is going to place a lot more emphasis, like you said, understanding the supply chain, who's playing in there,
Yeah.
and what's happening to your transaction.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's just going to raise that a little bit more. So I just, not everything is I'm selling it to party A and to party B, and that's the end of it. There are many different parties involved sometimes in certain transactions, and it's going to impact all of that.
Yeah. And to pick up on that, Michael, I think now with this rule coming into place, ownership risk is a frontline supply chain risk management issue as well. And so not only must you map your supply chain, but you must have, ownership and affiliate related data and intelligence to be able to support your supply chain risk management processes. I want to show you just an example of what that actually means in real life.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna share with you here kind of a very brief, simple example from Charon's data, and walk you through a case study. This is from our web-based search and data visualization platform that we call Charon Clearview. It's used by industry to investigate and uncover potential hidden risk as it relates to various financial crime and trade control issues. In this case, obviously, we're talking about as it relates to entities that are owned directly or indirectly or in the aggregate by those that would be subject to new export restrictions. And so we'll start here at the top of the chart with this entity, Shanghai Shuoxin Information Technology Company. Now, this is a company, as you see on the panel, it's on the US BIS entity list. It was added on that list in September of 2025 for developing computer-aided engineering software to support China's military-industrial complex. Now, in this same action, and I'll note this is this company we're talking about here. This is it's a Chinese publicly listed high-tech enterprise. It's headquartered in Shanghai, and they advertise that they specialize in computer-aided engineering, software, and simulation product development, and both development of hardware and software. And they're active in a range of industries: aerospace, defense, maritime, heavy equipment, etc. Now, in the same US government edition or announcement that added Shanghai Shuoxin Information Technology to the entity list, they added another one of its subsidiaries by the name of DEMX Limited for the same type of activity. Now, that's all that's on the government list as it relates to this network here. But we can see that Shanghai Shuoxin and DMX have their own respective subsidiaries. So, for example, DMX owns 100% ownership in two other companies, one that is based and registered in Hungary, and another that is based and registered in the United Kingdom. These two are not on the entity list, but based on the new affiliates rules, those two companies would now be subject to the same restriction that DEMX and Shanghai Shuoxin would. Now, in its own right, Shanghai Shuoxin owns other subsidiaries. And those other subsidiaries, although they're not on any government list, they themselves are involved in activity that relates to high risk or risk relevant end use. And so, for example, one of their subsidiaries that it owns 52% is this entity by the name of Beijing Fudi Guangtong Technology Development Company. And it's had multiple bids with Chinese military end users and the Chinese People's Liberation Army, as well as another subsidiary of Shanghai Shuoxin an entity that it owns 55% of indirectly, that's participated in bids submitted in support of the PLA's development of military equipment. And so this is just one example here that shows how, ownership structures are opaque by design and by nature, and affiliates and subsidiaries are often layered and obscured to avoid this type of detection. And so it's not enough to just look at a government list, but also it's not enough to look at just a registry entry. You need depth and context because, as we mentioned, ownership risk is now a frontline supply chain risk management issue. The other point I'll conclude this case study on is ownership, as it relates to those on government lists, is not bound by jurisdiction, because as we see here, some of the affiliates span borders, and exposure often extends downstream through multiple layers, 2, 3, and 4 degrees removed, outside of the initial jurisdiction where we started. And so that's where aggregate ownership across multiple restricted parties really comes into play, and across multiple jurisdictions also really comes into play. Any reactions to this, Michael? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you definitely painted a clear picture of how the BIS 50% rule would apply. So if you look at any one of those, we'll call affiliates, and an order came through, it's going to match, and that's going to give you the signal that says, can I move forward or not? Is it 50% or more, right? So it's giving you that knowledge right then and there. It's giving you, right, a document history too, or as you said, the snapshot today of what it looks like, right? Which is what we can do to move forward. So a lot of great information, and I think it explains the entities that are not listed and how important that is to now gather that information about your supply chain. So, Mark, I think you've made a very clear picture of the BIS 50% rule and how it applies.
Great. Looks like we've got some questions coming in, and happy to pause and
yeah, let me see. Looks like there is. So Angela, I want to make sure I'm only seeing one. So if there's more, just let me know, or if I'm not seeing anything there. I know Angela's behind the scene, everyone watching us, also making sure. So it just says a reminder to all participants is the U.S. regs have always stated we must know end user and end use, and the answer is absolutely. But the 50% rule brings now ownership in, and I think that expands it a little bit more. It does expand it a lot more on that end of it. So yes, know your customer, know your end use, very important. This is now, a much greater impact out to the processes that are out there. So doing business international is, it's always been a challenge. It's just, this is a big challenge that's going to come in and really impact organizations. So I think as orders come through and you're receiving orders, I think there needs to be that higher level internally as to who is in charge, who's managing this type of information, who can say yes or no, and not leave it to someone who's managing customer service, right? This is something that is at a higher level inside the organization. We got another question, Mark. Has BIS coordinated this rule with U.S. allies and partners? If not, does it plan to use the extra time to do that coordination? I'm not sure, Mark, if you can answer that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right voice to answer this type of question.
Yeah.
But I think looking back at how we got to this rule, as you mentioned, passing Michael, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the rollout of what historically has been described as the most robust sanctions and export control program ever implemented, brought to light some of these loopholes. And I think it was really focused around that period when we saw a lot of media reporting and investigations. We saw the US government take a very expansive approach to how it views evasion and diversion of its rules, both sanctions rules, but also export control rules. And we saw an expansive rollout of U.S. government advisories and alerts, including significantly guidance and alerts that have been put out by not just the Department of Commerce and BIS, but in coordination with the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, the Department of State, and elements from within the U.S. Interagency, in a coordinated way, pointing to how, not just on Russia, but how diversion and evasion of U.S. sanctions and export controls are taking place, with the focus obviously on how Russia is continuing to source some of the key materials and equipment that it needs to support its defense and military industrial base, but also focused on how Iran is sourcing and procuring goods that it needs to support its military industrial base and weapons and the development of its nuclear weapons program. And what these advisories did is put out the kind of the red flags for industry to think about how they approach evasion, and the responsibility of private industry, whether it's trading firms or financial institutions, in terms of complying with U.S. sanctions and U.S. export control regulations. And the U.S. government, and I'm talking about multiple agencies from within the U.S. government, Commerce, Trade, Justice, Treasury, and they put out red flags in terms of things that industry and compliance professionals need to pay attention to and need to keep an eye on that would indicate potential evasion or diversion, because private industry has a very significant role to play in terms of they're in the front line, right? They're the ones who are making these regulations effective and have there's no implementation without private sector coordination, and the U.S. government has been very clear and vocal about the importance of the private sector in supporting and enforcing these rules. And so some of the red flags we've seen, for example, talk specifically about paying attention to ownership, looking, for example, at things that relate to company profiles. How long does the company where you're processing a trade transaction, how long have they been in existence? What do they say about themselves? Things, for example, like paying attention to addresses or shared addresses, where that could be an indicator that if a company is new and it doesn't have a significant public profile, but the address indicates that it's tied to or is co-located or is based at the same location as something that is on the entity list or something that is on the sanctions list, that's a red flag indicator, right? And so the government has been proactive in coordinating their response to addressing the loopholes that they've been seeing as it relates to the rollout of expansive sanctions and expansive trade controls. So that effort is very coordinated. That's one element of it. The other element is, I think the US Congress has also been vocal about the importance of this rule. We've seen, going back 3 years, major congressional reports that talk about the importance of addressing loopholes in U.S. export and U.S. trade rules. So it's not just the executive branch. You've also got the legislative branch that is speaking out and has lent a voice in terms of the importance of addressing some of these loopholes that we're now talking about.
Yeah. So Mark, I'll just add, I think what you said is, your picture is great. And because, as if I was an exporter, I would say, well, we don't sell to Russia. We don't sell to Iran. We don't sell to Cuba. You really don't have too much to worry about here. But those two affiliates, one is in the UK and the other one's in Hungary. If an order came through and it's to the UK, I'm going to say there's a tendency to relax. This is whether our ally, it's a UK company, probably okay. And it may not be, right? It may not be because that ownership is tied to that Chinese company. So I only bring that up because, you know, we may have hard restrictions that said we don't sell to Russia. We don't have to worry about that. But you do, because of how this structure is, how these affiliates are out there, how, you know, they know when they're on the list, so they're going to create entities to allow goods to come into their network, and we just need to be on the alert.
Yeah.
That's extremely important out there. So, you know, I'm not going to say we don't need to carry about UK, but you know, there's a great example. Something in the UK, we may go, we don't need to worry too much. It's a UK company. They're our friends, right? The answer is nope. That's you got to be careful there too. Mark, we do have another question came through, and so it says, of course, you know, today we ask about end use and we end user, and customer responds back. They tell us, yes, I'm going to use it. This is what I'm using it for. But the question comes up, now that you presented this example about the BIS, how do we ask beyond end use and end use, end user, end use question? Is there any advice that you want to provide out there as to how do we go beyond just a buyer and a seller in a transaction and reach beyond that?
Yeah, Michael, I'd be more interested in your response
Okay.
to this. I think, you know, from my perspective, having a holistic view and a fact-based view in terms of understanding the end use and the end user exposure is relevant here. But also, as I mentioned, you know, keeping an eye towards the red flag indicators of exposure or risk that the U.S. government has put out in guidance going back several years, I think is very important here towards that end. But
absolutely, Mark, I would absolutely agree. The red flags, because if you're selling to a company that you know is a distributor, I don't want to call that a red flag. That's not a red flag, but you need to now dig for more information. Yeah. And you need to make sure that they're aware of the US regulation about this. So it just puts a little bit more onus on you to communicate and to give out the proper instruction depending on who that end user is. And no doubt, you know, if you have controlled goods, we're in a different world here, where if we have something that is controlled and it's under a license, we've always had those types of restrictions in place, and there's a huge onus put on there. In this case, though, we're going to need to know ownership and getting that information. Mark showed you an example of how to get something from a automation software that's out there. And like Mark said, there are providers out there who provide this. There's, you know, there's other ways you can, but you need to probably up the question and to know who's on the board, who are your owners. And I think you're going to need to more of at the time of maybe if you're onboarding new customers and things like that, maybe that's where that action needs to take place versus waiting for a transaction and starting to ship or starting to move it. You want to bring this way up in front of the process, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that the name of the game here is proactive awareness.
Yep.
Proactive due diligence.
Yeah. So we do have a couple more questions coming through. Do you feel the affiliates rule as written will stay intact when implemented next year? Will it change, evolve over the next 12 months?
You know, I've tried not to predict things because I'm typically wrong. And so I don't want to jinx it one way or the other. I truly have no idea, right? I can tell you that from the memorandum that BIS put out just on Monday of this week, it appears that the rule as written is still published in the Federal Register, and that the rule as written will be going into effect on November 9th of 2026. That's truly all I know based on just that memorandum. I don't have any further insight, but could it change? Absolutely. Could it evolve?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Could it stay the same? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yep. So Mark, we have a question come in that I'm going to also try and answer it, and I would welcome if you have any additional comments to it. So the question comes in, says, can you comment on the obligation of a freight forwarder facilitating transport with respect to this? Also in terms of goods themselves and determining the likelihood that they are subject to control. So I'll add that says, when BIS issued this rule, they definitely spoke to exporters.
Yeah.
They called them out. They also acknowledged that there are other parties involved in a transaction, such as a bank, such as your third-party logistics providers, right? And everyone is definitely playing a role here. However, they specifically called out the exporter here, right? However, and Mark mentioned this, red flags, are very, very important. And when they issued this interim final rule, they did call out the red flag. So they're making reference to that. I think, as we all know, a freight forwarder, if they truly are your designated freight forwarder, I think they could and should, in my opinion, help if you're looking for what type of solutions or whatever. But normally the freight forwarder is coming in later in the transaction. It's when things are starting to move, which could be a little late if you're trying to determine an entity or a listed entity or a non-listed entity as part of this transaction, right? Because you've already spent some time, you've already spent some money, you've already gotten the goods ready. So it's a little later in the transaction. However, you should have a good conversation. If you are an exporter, you should have a good conversation with the freight forwarder if they're your designation forwarder, and truly ask, what are they doing and working together, in my opinion. So there is a question. It's also, how about the likelihood and the subject to controls? Nothing really changes here in that regards. I mean, the exporter is responsible for determining, the export classification and whether they, are licensable or not. That's, and the forwarder is definitely there as a partner to help and can give them some assistance. But that, we all know that responsibility is definitely heavier on the exporter. But the forwarder still has a level of responsibility too. They cannot just say, I'm not responsible.
Oh, that's great. I believe we've answered most of the questions. Anything else?
Yeah, I don't see anything else coming through. So to the audience out there, if you have a question, type it in quickly or so, and we'll do our best to answer it for you. All right. Well, Mark, I'm just going to do a time check. It's 3:49. We have this over at, at 4 or whatever. So I think we've addressed those questions. I think we talked about what is the rule? What's the pause really mean? And really mean is, let's get ready, get started if you haven't already. And then what should companies be doing? And I think you gave them a very clear picture of, here's something that you could see. This is how the BIS 50% rule applies. And I think it works really, really well. So I'm sure if people have questions outside of here, I know your information is available for them, and they can contact you for any follow-ups on that end of it.
Yeah,
Angela,
we're happy to always engage and answer questions and walk through even more case studies. This is what we do.
So one of the important things to everyone out here, you spent some time with us today. This event and the content, it has been accredited by NCBFAA for education in the Educational Institute. You will get one CCS, MCS, or LCB credit. If you've attended, you will get the code. So if you're not attending, you don't know even what I'm saying. But we'll give you that after we conclude our program. You'll see the code.
Great.
And
thank you, Michael, and thank you, AI, for hosting this event. I've learned a lot from you, just hearing you speak, and learned a lot and challenged by the questions, and interested in continuing the conversation, and making sure that we're all getting ready or are ready for the effective implementation of this new rule one day.
Yep. Mark, thank you so much for your participation. The expertise that you brought to today's session has been excellent. And again, thank you for sponsoring this event. And thanks to everyone taking time out of your busy schedule to join us and learn a little bit more about the BIS 50% rule. So thank you, everyone.